The morning mist hung thick over the rolling Maryland countryside on September 17, 1862. Within hours, that mist would be replaced by gunpowder smoke so dense that soldiers could barely see 10 feet ahead. By sunset, over 23,000 men would be killed, wounded, or missing, making it the single bloodiest day in American history. The topic of this video is the bloodiest day in American history, Antietam Explained. In our previous video, we explored the Confederate invasion of Maryland and the dramatic discovery of Lee's lost orders. Now, we witness the catastrophic collision that followed. Welcome to History Unlocked, where we bring America's most pivotal moments to life. If you're passionate about understanding the events that shaped our nation, please subscribe and press the bell icon so you never miss our deep dives into history. By mid-September 1862, General Robert E. Lee had led his Army of Northern Virginia across the Potomac River into Union territory. His audacious gamble aimed to win a decisive victory on Northern soil, potentially forcing European recognition of the Confederacy and undermining Northern morale before the fall elections. But fate intervened when Union soldiers discovered Lee's Special Orders 191 wrapped around 3 cigars in an abandoned Confederate campsite. Those orders revealed that Lee had dangerously divided his army. General George McClellan, commanding the Army of the Potomac, now possessed an intelligence windfall that generals dream of: complete knowledge of his enemy's dispositions and intentions. Yet McClellan, ever cautious and convinced he faced overwhelming numbers, moved with characteristic deliberation. He spent precious hours confirming the order's authenticity and planning his response. This delay gave Lee critical time to recognize his peril and begin concentrating his scattered forces near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. Along the banks of Antietam Creek, Lee chose his defensive position carefully. Sharpsburg sat on a low ridge with Antietam Creek to the east providing a natural obstacle. To his back flowed the Potomac River, a dangerous position that left little room for retreat. But Lee was not planning to retreat. He was planning to hold and then counterattack. Despite having fewer than 40,000 men against McClellan's 75,000, Lee understood the tactical advantages of terrain and interior lines. He positioned his forces in a 3-mile arc, anchoring his left flank near the Dunker Church, his center at Sunken Road, and his right near Burnside Bridge. The stage was set for an encounter that would test both armies beyond anything they had yet experienced. McClellan's battle plan called for a sequential assault rather than a coordinated simultaneous attack, a decision that would allow Lee to shift defenders to threatened sectors throughout the day. The Union commander intended to strike Lee's left flank first, then his center, and finally his right. It was a plan that surrendered surprise and the overwhelming advantage of numbers. September 17th dawned cool and misty. At first light, Union General Joseph Hooker launched the opening assault with his 1st Corps, driving south toward the Dunker Church through the now infamous cornfield. The fighting there would become some of the most savage of the entire war. Standing corn, still green and shoulder high, provided concealment for both sides as regiments collided at point-blank range. The 12th Massachusetts and the Texas Brigade met in that cornfield in a storm of rifle fire that mowed down men like wheat before a scythe. The cornfield changed hands 15 times that morning. Soldiers described walking on bodies rather than ground. Artillery fire from both sides swept the field with canister shot, turning stalks and men into shredded debris. General Hooker himself would later write that every stalk of corn in the field was cut down by bullets as though harvested by a scythe. In the span of 3 hours, over 8,000 men fell dead or wounded in and around that single 30-acre field. Confederate reinforcements under General John Bell Hood arrived just as Hooker's assault threatened to break through. Hood's men, who had been in the rear cooking breakfast, dropped their rations and rushed forward. Their counterattack was ferocious. Hood's division struck the Union line with such force that they temporarily drove the attackers back across the cornfield. But the cost was staggering. In less than half an hour, Hood's division suffered over 60% casualties. When later asked where his division was, Hood replied grimly, "Dead on the field." As the battle around the cornfield raged, Union General Joseph Mansfield brought his 12th Corps forward to reinforce Hooker. Mansfield, a 60-year-old career officer who had never commanded troops in combat, rode forward to assess the situation personally. Within minutes, he was mortally wounded by Confederate rifle fire. His corps continued the assault, pushing toward the Dunker Church through the East Woods and into another area that would earn a grim nickname, the West Woods. The struggle around the Dunker Church, a simple whitewashed building belonging to a pacifist German Baptist congregation, embodied the day's terrible irony. This house of peace became the epicenter of violence as Union forces made repeated attempts to seize the strategic position. Confederate defenders, outnumbered but fighting from superior positions, poured devastating fire into each assault. The ground around the church was described by witnesses as carpeted with bodies in blue uniforms. Think about that for a moment, men fighting and dying around a church, a place built for worship and peace, transformed into the pivot point of slaughter. The Dunkirk church would survive the battle, though scarred by bullets, standing as a silent witness to the horror that surrounded it. By mid-morning, the focus of battle shifted southward to the center of Lee's line. Here, a sunken farm road ran for half a mile along a slight ridge. Confederate infantry under General D.H. Hill had positioned themselves in this natural trench, creating a nearly perfect defensive position. When Union forces under General William French advanced across open ground toward this position, they walked into a killing zone that would forever be known as Bloody Lane. The Confederates in Sunken Road held their fire until the Union troops were less than 100 yards away, then unleashed volleys that struck the advancing lines like a physical wall. Men fell in rows. The survivors pressed forward, halted, fired, and were cut down in turn. For nearly 4 hours, Union forces made repeated assaults against Sunken Road, and for nearly 4 hours, Confederate defenders held firm behind their earthen parapet. The breakthrough came when Union forces found an angle that allowed them to enfilade the Confederate position, firing down the length of the Sunken Road rather than straight into it. This flanking fire turned the defensive position into a death trap. Confederates were shot from the side, falling in heaps along the road. Survivors attempted to retreat, but many were cut down as they climbed out of the trench. When Union forces finally captured Sunken Road in early afternoon, they found Confederate dead piled 2 and 3 deep in places. Witnesses reported that the bodies lay so thick that one could walk the length of the road without touching the ground. From that day forward, it would be called Bloody Lane. The fighting at Bloody Lane had opened a dangerous gap in Lee's center. For a critical moment, the Union had an opportunity to break through and divide the Confederate army. McClellan had substantial reserves available, nearly 20,000 fresh troops who had not yet fired a shot. A determined push here might have destroyed Lee's army and potentially ended the war. But McClellan, still convinced he faced superior numbers, held back his reserves. The opportunity passed. Lee shifted defenders into the gap, and the center held. While the center blazed with violence, the Union's third assault, against Lee's right flank, had stalled in frustration. General Ambrose Burnside commanded the Union 9th Corps on the eastern side of Antietam Creek. His orders were to cross the creek, seize the heights beyond, and roll up Lee's right flank. But a relatively small Confederate force of about 400 Georgians under General Robert Toombs occupied a strong position on the western bluff overlooking a stone bridge that crossed the creek. This bridge would enter history as Burnside Bridge. The approach to the bridge funneled attackers into a narrow front under direct fire from Georgians positioned in quarries and stone walls above. Burnside made repeated attempts to storm the bridge, and each assault was bloodily repulsed. Soldiers trying to cross the narrow span became easy targets. Bodies piled up on the bridge and along the eastern bank. For 3 hours, a handful of Georgians held off an entire Union corps. Have you ever considered how terrain and positioning can multiply the effectiveness of a small force? This was that principle in brutal action. Geography made 400 Confederates equal to thousands of Union soldiers. Eventually, Union troops found alternate fording points both upstream and downstream, crossing the creek and threatening to flank the Georgian defenders. Only then did Toombs withdraw his men, and Burnside's forces finally surged across. But Burnside's crossing had consumed the morning and early afternoon. By the time his corps reformed on the western bank and began advancing toward Sharpsburg, it was after 3 p.m. His 8,000 men pushed forward against light resistance, driving toward the town and threatening to cut off Lee's line of retreat to the Potomac. For Lee, this was the crisis moment of the battle. He had no reserves left. If Burnside broke through, the Army of Northern Virginia would be trapped and destroyed. At that critical moment, Confederate General A.P. Hill's division arrived on the field after a forced march from Harper's Ferry, 17 miles away in just 8 hours. Hill's men, exhausted and many still wearing Union blue uniforms captured at Harper's Ferry, slammed into Burnside's exposed left flank. The surprise attack threw Burnside's advance into confusion. Union troops, already tired from their day's fighting, reeled back toward Antietam Creek. Hill's timely arrival had saved Lee's army from catastrophe. As darkness fell on September 17th, the guns gradually fell silent. Across 3 separate battlegrounds, the Cornfield and Dunkirk Church in the north, Bloody Lane in the center, and Burnside Bridge in the south, over 23,000 Americans had become casualties. The Army of the Potomac had suffered approximately 12,400 killed, wounded, or missing. The Army of Northern Virginia had lost around 10,300. No single day before or since in American history has produced such staggering casualties. The night after the battle was remembered by survivors as one of the most horrifying experiences of their lives. The cries of wounded men covered the battlefield, calling for water, for help, for their mothers. Soldiers from both armies ventured into the darkness to retrieve wounded comrades. In some places, informal truces developed as men from north and south worked side by side to carry the injured to aid stations. The shared humanity in those dark hours stood in stark contrast to the day's violence. September 18th dawned on a field of unimaginable carnage. Both armies remained in position, exhausted, bloodied, but still confronting each other across Antietam Creek. McClellan possessed substantial reserves and fresh troops, yet he made no move to renew the battle. Lee's army, shattered and depleted, held its ground through the day, almost daring McClellan to attack again. That night, under cover of darkness, Lee withdrew his army across the Potomac River back into Virginia. The invasion of the North was over. Strategically, Antietam was a Union victory. Lee's offensive had been halted and his army forced back into Confederate territory, but it was a victory that felt incomplete. McClellan had possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and had failed to destroy Lee's army when opportunity presented itself. President Lincoln, frustrated by McClellan's chronic caution, would relieve him of command 6 weeks later. Yet Antietam's significance extended far beyond the tactical outcome. The battle provided Lincoln with the victory he needed to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which he announced 5 days later on September 22. That document transformed the character of the war from a conflict to preserve the Union into a war to end slavery. It ensured that Britain and France, both of which had abolished slavery, would not recognize or support the Confederacy. The bloodiest day in American history had thus become a turning point toward freedom. The farms around Sharpsburg bore scars for decades. The cornfield, Bloody Lane, and the ground around Dunkerchurch were stained with blood. Farmers plowing fields for years afterward continued to uncover bullets, buckles, and bones. The stone bridge crossing Antietam Creek would forever carry Burnside's name as a memorial to the men who fell trying to cross it. And the simple white Dunkerchurch, rebuilt after being dismantled in the 1920s and reconstructed in the 1960s, still stands today as a monument to the 23,000 casualties of that terrible September day. Antietam reminds us of the incalculable cost of division and civil conflict. On that single day, more Americans were killed or wounded than on D-Day. More Americans fell than in the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and the Spanish-American War combined. It was a day when the future of the nation hung in balance, when brothers truly fought against brothers, and when the fields of Maryland were consecrated with the blood of Americans from both North and South. The bravery and sacrifice displayed on both sides deserve our remembrance, even as we recognize the profound tragedy of Americans killing Americans. If you want to continue exploring the pivotal moments that define our nation, subscribe to History Unlocked. Press the bell icon for notifications about our future history documentaries. Give this video a like, and join us as we unlock more chapters of American history together.